So our first speaker is, ma'am, you want to introduce?
Yeah. So the first speaker is Dr. Sonia Vadhavan. She is Director Professor in the Department of Anesthesiology, Maulana Azad Medical College, working under me. And her areas of interest are difficult area, pediatric and obstetric anesthesia. And she's taking her lecture on perioperative management of a COVID patient. Over to Dr. Sonia.
At the outset, I would like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to be a part of this academic event. I shall be speaking on perioperative management of a post-COVID patient. COVID-19 started in early 2020 for us in India, and it has continued to be. This has resulted in many patients landing up with a post-COVID sequelae. The SARS-CoV-2 virus is the pathogen responsible for the coronavirus disease 2019 pandemic, which has resulted in global healthcare crisis and strained the health resources. Though primarily affecting the respiratory system, it is a multi-organ disease leading to morbidities and sequelae in the COVID survivors. Both symptomatic and asymptomatic COVID patients can develop these sequelae. It may be in the form of short-term effects or long-term effects. Post-COVID syndrome can include residual inflammation and its effects. A patient may complain of fatigue, muscle weakness, may have hyperproteinemia, there may be increased frailty. Post-traumatic stress disorder, depression and anxiety may be a part of these patients. More importantly, they may have multi-organ damage. In the respiratory system, the patient may land up with pulmonary fibrosis leading to interstitial lung disease with impaired diffusion. There may be a decrease in the FRC. There may be hyperreactivity of the airway in these patients, and these patients may be chronically hypoxemic. Post-COVID myocarditis and fibrosis can lead to atrial and ventricular tachyarrhythmias. Left ventricular diastolic systolic dysfunction may develop. The patients may develop pulmonary artery hypertension, may be having heart failure with raised serum BNP levels, or the cardiac enzymes may still be elevated. In the neurological sequelae, there may be persistence of dizziness. Due to cerebrovascular accidents during the COVID period, patient may land up with sequelae of that. There may be some degree of sequelae because of encephalitis. Anosmia and loss of taste may still persist. COVID-19 is a hypercoagulable state and thrombotic events can occur after recovery. Embolic phenomena post-COVID leading to myocardial infarction, CVA, pulmonary thromboembolism, limb ischemia and mesenteric ischemia may be there. Additionally, these patients may have thrombocytopenia. There may be coagulopathies. These patients may have suffered acute renal injury and hepatic injury and may still have residual dysfunction of these systems. Hormonal and metabolic disturbances due to involvement of thyroid, pancreas, and adrenal gland may be there. Importantly, patients can be on polypharmacy, may be still receiving steroids, anticoagulants, and bronchodilators. There may be a worsening of pre-existing medical conditions like chronic lung disease, diabetes, hypertension, renal disease, cardiac disease. Now, what are the surgeries that a post-COVID patient presents for? Maybe elective surgeries like cholecystectomies, prostatectomies, THR, TKR, plastic surgeries, tonsillectomies, or emergency surgeries like cesarean deliveries, patients with trauma, appendicectomies, laparotomies. Or the patient may actually present for a surgical procedure with a complication of COVID. Example, post-COVID mucormycosis, limb ischemia due to post-COVID thrombosis, post-COVID acute mesenteric ischemia. So there is a wide range of surgical patients post-COVID. In view of this, the American Society of Anesthesiology and the Anesthesia Patient Safety Foundation came out with a joint statement in the early part of this year for elective surgeries and anesthesia in these subset of patients. In the Times of India also, in the end of May 2021, there was an article in which they had mentioned that ICMR says wait for 6 weeks for surgery after COVID. There is a reason behind all this. So we shall be discussing it in details. Subsequently, the Indian Journal of Anesthesia came out with the ISA advisory on perioperative management of post-COVID-19 surgical patients. Similarly, an article on the preoperative evaluation in a post-COVID patient for elective surgery has very nicely discussed it in details. A clinical trial is still going on in US where they are studying the long-term effects and the immunity status of the patient post-COVID. Now, why is the timing important? It is important and it will depend upon what was the severity of the disease, what was the duration of the COVID illness, was there any multi-organ involvement post-COVID, what is the effect of medications the patient is being put on. So the ASA and the APSF decided and came out with the following advisory. If the COVID disease was mild and non-respiratory symptoms were there, then 4 weeks of delay for an elective surgery is absolutely adequate. However, if the patient was symptomatic with cough and shortness of breath, but there was no hospitalization, then wait for 6 weeks before elective surgery. If the patient was symptomatic, diabetic, or immunocompromised, or hospitalized, then 8 to 10 weeks before an elective surgery is done. If the patient was requiring ICU admission, then a minimum of 12 weeks post-COVID recovery before a patient is taken up for an elective procedure. Now, preoperative evaluation, along with what is routinely done, we had a three-pronged approach in post-COVID patient. Assessment of the functional status, assessment of sequelae of SARS-CoV-2 infection on the various organ systems, and implication of any medication the patient is taking post-COVID. After evaluation, which was based on a detailed history and physical examination, functional assessment of exercise tolerance, breath holding time, ambulatory oxygen saturation measurement, and a 6-minute walk test, whatever was possible amongst all of this should be done to assess the status of the patient. Hemoglobin estimation to assess anemia and optimize preoperative to prevent intraoperative hypoxemia and increase myocardial work, also to estimate the maximum allowable blood loss. Total leukocyte count to rule out any underlying infection, kidney function test, especially patients on amphotericin B therapy, and creatinine clearance was the most accurate. LFT in patients with documented pre-existing liver disease, history of severe COVID-19 infection, elderly patients or patients with a higher physical status. Blood sugar estimation in all diabetic patients, in patients on steroid use, patients with severe COVID-19 disease. X-ray chest or CT scan was individualized as per each case. ECG to be done in all patients. Echo for patients with cardiac disease or who landed up with post-COVID cardiomyopathy or patients on amphotericin B therapy. ABG analysis was not routinely done because the problems may be more and only reserved for patients wherever there was a specific indication. Other relevant investigations as required were done. According to the CDC, they suggested that an RT-PCR need not be repeated before 90 days after the COVID infection until unless there are fresh signs and symptoms to suggest a reinfection. This is a battery of tests which is suggested, and depending upon whether the procedure is minor, intermediate, or major procedure, whether the patient was asymptomatic or belonging to a higher ASA physical status 2, 3, or 4, the number of tests were accordingly decided for those patients, and one can refer to this table. Now, there are parameters to assess the functional capacity. So 6-minute walk test has now become quite routinely being used in many of the patients, especially in the post-COVID era. It is indicative of a cardiopulmonary reserve. The distance which the patient walks at a stretch is about 30 meters to and fro, will keep walking for about 6 minutes. If the patient gets tired, will stop. And again, after the patient feels better, can restart. So the total distance the patient covers over 6 minutes is counted and is measured. It should approximately be between 400 to 700 meters. If possible, a pulse oximeter for heart rate and SpO2 monitoring can be attached. Frailty score, the Edmonton Frailty Scale is a 17-point scale and can be performed within less than a few minutes. And it helps us to know if the patient is belonging to a moderate or a severe frailty score, then the perioperative prognosis may be guarded and has to be explained to the patient and the relatives preoperatively. After an evaluation, optimization is a must. A patient should preferably fully vaccinated before surgery, and the surgery should be conducted at least 2 weeks after the second dose has been received. Enhancing the functional capacity and multi-system optimization is a goal, which we can achieve by ensuring cessation of smoking, use of bronchodilators, chest physiotherapy with deep breathing exercises to optimize the lung conditions, correction of the hydration status, improvement in nutrition, adjustment of the dose of steroids in the perioperative period, and to have a tight perioperative glycemic control. Patients may be on antithrombotics and antiplatelets. If the patient is on low dose aspirin, it can be continued. However, patients undergoing eye surgery, prosthetic surgery, or neurosurgery, it needs to be stopped. If the patient is a low cardiac risk patient on dual antiplatelet therapy, it is stopped 7 to 10 days prior to surgery. In high risk of cardiac events, it is stopped 5 days preoperatively and can be resumed 24 hours postoperatively. Antithrombotic agents like low molecular weight heparin, unfractionated heparin, factor 10A inhibitors, or direct oral anticoagulants may be used in these post-COVID patients. If it is being given on a prophylactic dose, then 12 hours before we need to stop it. If on a therapeutic dose, then at least 24 hours before. If a patient is on unfractionated heparin for more than 4 days, then the concerns of thrombocytopenia should be kept in mind. We should discontinue direct oral anticoagulants at least 24 to 48 hours prior to surgery and 72 hours before a central neuraxial block is planned. In the anesthetic management, as is the case, normally regional anesthesia is preferred over general anesthesia because the risks involved are much less. There is less of polypharmacy. We should ensure adequate preoperative anxiolysis with reassurance and medication. If GA or regional is planned, standard ASA monitoring has to be done. If GA is planned, then preoperative and intraoperative analgesia can be ensured with fentanyl. Adequate inspired oxygen concentration to be maintained to achieve optimal oxygenation in the patient and to keep the oxygen saturation above 94%. Patient can be induced with propofol or etomidate depending upon the clinical situation. Muscle relaxation can be achieved with vecuronium or atracurium, and if a rapid sequence induction is required, then suxamethonium or ocuronium can be used. Anesthesia is maintained with an air-oxygen mixture with sevoflurane, iso, or desflurane. As discussed earlier, higher FiO2 to ensure adequate oxygenation, lung protective ventilation with lower tidal volumes of pressure-controlled ventilation to be maintained, HME filters to be used. At the end of the procedure, complete neuromuscular reversal to be done and extubate the trachea only when the patient is fully conscious with reflexes intact. If the patient has cardiac morbidities, then maybe IBP monitoring, cardiac output monitoring may be required. If the patient is a known acute lung injury, liver injury, kidney injury patient, then avoid suxamethonium, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, use judicious fluid and electrolyte therapy. Hemodynamic monitoring is a must. This is just to emphasize that vigilance is the key. Whenever it is important in all patients undergoing GA or regional anesthesia, and since the post-COVID patient is quite a morbid patient with comorbidities and sequelae, so intraoperative vigilance becomes even more important. The mode of ventilation, as you can see over here, is pressure-controlled ventilation. This is a patient who was undergoing FES for mucormycosis post-COVID. And we can see we are sharing the airway with the surgeon. Monitoring, all non-invasive monitoring is being done. Adequate IV fluid replacement, monitoring the blood loss, and the surgery has to be done throughout with great vigilance. At the end of the procedure, anesthesia is reversed and the patient is shifted to the postoperative ward initially or the ICU depending upon the patient's condition. If the patient requires a very transient ventilatory support in the form of non-invasive ventilation, that can be provided in the postoperative ward or in the ICU, and then subsequently when the patient stabilizes can be shifted to the ward. Adequate analgesia using multimodal technique is a must. Now coming on to patients post-COVID undergoing emergency surgery. Well, there is a limited time available for evaluation and optimization. However, thorough history and examination with emphasis on the respiratory and cardiovascular system should be done. Breath holding time and ABG can be done to assess the cardiorespiratory reserve. 6-minute walk test may not be feasible in these patients. Thorough airway assessment must be done. Investigation should include complete blood count, LFT, KFT, coagulation profile, blood sugar, ketones, D-dimer, and serum BNP. Whatever is possible. Whether if serum BNP is not possible, then maybe we can let it be. But if time permits and investigation is available, then we should do it to rule out heart failure. X-ray chest ECG in all patients. Appropriate informed consent and need for post-op ventilation in ICU wherever indicated. In the time available, we should optimize hydration status, acid-base status, and electrolyte status of the patient, nebulize with bronchodilator therapy, continue perioperative steroid administration wherever indicated. Patient with ongoing therapeutic anticoagulation who are presenting for emergency surgery, and we need to reverse the effect of low molecular weight heparin. We can do that with 10 to 15 ml per kg of fresh frozen plasma. In addition to routine monitoring, bispectral index and neuromuscular monitoring to be done to titrate anesthetic agents and avoid over medication under general anesthesia. All these patients should be pre-oxygenated for 3 minutes, and para-oxygenation with nasal prong should continue. Choice of induction drug and dose is to be titrated to minimize the hemodynamic fluctuations. Suxamethonium to be avoided in patients with prolonged immobility and neuromuscular weakness. Sevoflurane is the preferred inhalational agent since it's effective bronchodilation and there is a rapid removal. Patients should undergo lung protective ventilation and higher FiO2 for adequate oxygenation. Pressure control ventilation may be used. Multimodal analgesia and proper timing of the opioid should be ensured. Complete neuromuscular reversal at the end of the procedure, and the trachea is extubated when the patient is fully conscious with intact reflexes. Post-extubation, patient may receive CPAP or HFNC for adequate oxygenation in the ICU. Vigilant postoperative monitoring and thromboprophylaxis in patients indicated should be initiated. Coming on to regional anesthesia, as discussed earlier, wherever feasible, give a neuralaxial block or ultrasound-guided nerve blocks are preferred, especially in patients with significantly decreased cardiorespiratory reserves. Thromboprophylaxis and coagulopathy to be ruled out in them. If patient is on anticoagulant and surgery is emergent, then avoid regional anesthesia. If the patient is on anticoagulants, then the specific medication patient is on should be known. The last dose received should be known, and whether the patient was on therapeutic or prophylactic dose. This will help us decide when it would be safe to administer regional anesthesia in these patients. Coming on to emergency cesarean delivery. Why am I talking about this particular surgery above other emergency surgery? Because it's one of the most common surgeries being done in a post-COVID female patient. Regional anesthesia is preferred. If general anesthesia is given, it is in view of hemodynamic instability or specific obstetric indication. Rapid sequence induction is given in patients undergoing general anesthesia, and use of suxamethonium for securing the airway will depend upon the risk-benefit ratio. Higher FiO2 is to be maintained till delivery of fetus. Ensure good post-operative analgesia. We can administer transversus abdominis plain block. Early ambulation and start mechanical and pharmacological thromboprophylaxis in the subset of patients. Now we know post-COVID mucormycosis is a very morbid condition in these patients. And these patients come up with multiple comorbidities in the form of CAD, hypertension, diabetes. The mucormycosis may spread even intracerebrally or may involve the lungs. So I would like to just share the successful management of the initial 26 mucor patients who came to us at Lok Nayak Hospital and MAMC in the month of June. And we managed 26 such patients in the initial 2 weeks. Of course, after that, we have done more than 200 plus mucor cases. You can see that it is possible to manage such a morbid patient only when there is good teamwork between the anesthesiologists, ENT surgeons, ophthalmologists, technical staff, nursing staff. So some of the challenges that we faced in this, the patient had a difficult airway because of mucormycosis. In the second patient, there was a continuous trickling of blood in the pharynx, and that was a challenge while securing the airway. Amphotericin B related challenges. The surgery which the patient undergoes, either patient is undergoing FES, which is endoscopic, or maybe undergoing an open procedure. Airway is shared. In all these patients, we secured the airway using the video laryngoscope, the CMAC. The problem because of the intraoral bleeding, the mutilation at the end of the surgery. In this case, you can see the whole of the palate has been removed and packing has been done, and this is secured with the help of sutures. So you need to plan as per the case and respond accordingly. Going through the literature that was available and on the basis of the experience, the initial experience, we came out with the post-COVID Mucor OT guidelines from the Department of Anesthesia and Critical Care, MAMC. And I'm just sharing these guidelines with you all. And at the end, I would like to say that managing a post-COVID patient, and these were all mucormycosis patient, and they all went home. It was the best reward for any of us to see smiles on the faces of our patients, recover and go home. These are some of the references. Best wishes, prepare well, work hard, and all the best.
Thank you, Dr. Sonia, for that wonderful
Thank you.
lecture and very good personal experiences. So,
Thank you, ma'am.
We can move on to the next lecture.
Madam, I'd like to just comment, Dr. Kirti.
Yes.
Yes, Madam, it was excellently presented lecture. I must appreciate. Only one thing to add, if there is a minor surgery, say it's a simple tooth removal, how they should go? There are no guidelines for the dentist to go for it, ma'am.
Yes, thank you, ma'am, for your kind words. Yes, there was a slide in which I had shown that if the surgery is a minor procedure, if it is a minor procedure like a dental extraction, then we should have the basic minimum investigations like the CBC should definitely be there, and ECG and electrolyte should be there, depending upon also the severity. So that table very nicely demarcates into a minor, intermediate, and a major procedure, and again into an asymptomatic or a ASA physical status 1 and a symptomatic or a ASA physical status 2, 3, and 4. So the minimum investigations they have suggested is CBC, electrolytes, and ECG, and rest would depend upon the comorbidities and the sequelae in that particular patient. Even if the patient is for a minor procedure, but the patient has severe morbidities, I think we should go ahead with the minimum investigations as per these guidelines. It's a dynamic thing. It may change as we progress on and there is more scientific literature available.
Yes, ma'am. And Madam, second thing, I'll just like to say that when the patient comes for emergency operation,
yes,
cesarean section, as you mentioned very rightly, we are taking the patient with regional anesthesia, but our
yes,
experience is more that during the cesarean section, we are taking the patient, but in the post-operative period, we have lost many young patients, madam, because of the thromboembolic phenomena, ma'am. Because we have to take the patient. So that was
yes,
a bad story on the cesarean side, ma'am.
Ma'am, actually, in fact, we have had a series of maximum COVID cesarean deliveries.
But here we are talking about mainly the other patients. Yes, but even for COVID patients, in our own institution, we have done more than 500 cases, including cesareans, all types of COVID patients. And the patients, the mortality was only in those patients who would have died otherwise also, like they were really sick.
Yes, yes.
Or who bled so much during cesarean that, you see, every cesarean is not always, doesn't always lead to good results. So that mortality and morbidity was as much as in normal patients only, non-COVID patients.
That differed with the COVID patient. And normally the patients will not go for any complications because of the blood coagulation things and all the other factors that work for COVID. We lost many patients after the cesarean was done.
Ma'am, in fact,
within 24 hours, ma'am.
Ma'am, actually, I would like to say, like Dr. Kirti ma'am has said, our personal experience has been out of, say, 200 patients, we only gave general anesthesia to about 5 to 7 of them, and the rest of them received regional anesthesia, which was typically spinal anesthesia and not epidural. And we were keeping in mind the coagulation status of the patient only in those which I've already mentioned in my slide where it was permissible. We did give, and in the post-COVID status also in the present scenario, we are using regional anesthesia spinal for post-COVID patients. Maybe monitoring is required and mechanical.
But madam, our patients had regional only, but maybe the status might have not been the correct one what we were given, maybe. You never know, because it
Thank
was
you,
very
ma'am,
nice.
because all different
nice.
experiences
Yeah.
will go a long
In
way.
our own institution, the mortality was pretty low.
I won't
In-
say
in
that it was
cesarean-
low, but it was on a
No,
little
our
higher
institu-
side because of this
because
complication.
no, in our institution, the cesarean mortality was really very low, and even the non-cesarean patients, it was low only. Like the mortality was same as in non-COVID patients.
And another thing, madam, the
Yes, ma'am.
physiotherapists, they run a post-COVID rehab center. It is cardio and respiratory both. So we should be considering that when we have a waiting period of like 6 to 8 weeks.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. I have mentioned about cardiac
mention
and respiratory, but yes, it will be good if we have a dedicated physio department which can take care of these post-COVID patients while we are preparing them for elective
Madam, it
surgery.
really makes a difference for cardiac and respiratory both. And it
Thank
works
you,
out
ma'am.
well when we take the patient for operation, ma'am. Thank you,
Thank you,
ma'am.
ma'am.
Again, once again, it was a nice presentation. Appreciated, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you so much.